On behalf of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, I'd like to welcome everyone to our panel discussion this evening, officially titled Sectarianization, ISIS, the Syrian Conflict, and the Future of the Middle East. This event is co-sponsored by the Aspen Institute's Middle East program and the Conflict Resolution Institute here at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School. Our Center of Middle East Studies has had a long-standing interest in the question of Syria, and by long-standing I mean 2 years because we're only 2 years old. Our first publication is an edited volume on the question of Syria, the Syria dilemma, based on our first academic conference. And most of last year, our center was busy organizing events related to the question of Syria, U.S. foreign policy, and the future of the Middle East. And I'd like to take some sort of satisfaction in saying that when many people thought that Syria didn't matter anymore, that Syria could be ignored, that the conflict in Syria could be contained within its borders, we were a center that didn't believe in that, and we picked up on the Syria question right from the beginning and stuck with it. And now I think we can see the importance of why Syria actually does matter. Syria today is at the top of the U.S. national agenda, U.S. foreign policy agenda, and the global agenda. And today, I'm announcing that our center is adopting a new focus. One of our research themes that we will be pursuing over the course of the next year is this whole question of sectarianism, both in Syria and across the broader Middle East. It's a future edited volume that we are planning to produce. Ladies and gentlemen, it is widely recognized that the primary challenge today facing President Obama with respect to his new strategy in the Middle East lies in Syria. Syria is where ISIS was reborn in the context of the Syrian civil war. Syria is where the 3 Western hostages were killed. And Syria is where 2/3 of the military forces of ISIS are currently located. As one of our speakers tonight, Joshua Landis, has noted, Syria is the Gordian knot of Obama's ISIS campaign, or stated differently, all roads lead to Damascus. Tonight we seek to examine one particular aspect of the conflict in Syria and the broader Middle East, the question of religious sectarianism and the politics of sectarian mobilization. What are its roots? Are they secular or religious in nature? Who are the key social and political actors that are responsible for perpetuating a process of sectarianization in the Middle East and in Syria in particular? And how does this process exactly unfold? What are the dynamics? And how can this destabilizing set of effects be mitigated or brought under control? More broadly, the overarching sort of research question that we are interested in pursuing both at our center, but tonight we want to sort of make a first stab at, is exploring the question under what social conditions does sectarian mobilization emerge and proliferate? And under what social conditions can sectarian mobilization be thwarted? We're interested in examining the local, the regional, and the international dynamics that have fueled this particular process, a topic which is now at the height of the U.S. and international agenda. And joining us tonight to help us better understand this topic and to decipher this topic are 3 invited guests who will be speaking with us tonight, and I have their bios here. 3 invited distinguished guests who will help us decipher this topic. Stephen Heydemann is the Vice President of Applied Research on Conflict at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. He's the author of Authoritarianism in Syria, Institutions and Social Conflict from 1946 to 1970. He's also the editor of War, Institutions and Social Change in the Middle East and co-editor of Middle East Authoritarianisms, Governance, Contestation, and Regime Resilience in Syria and Iran. His previous positions include director of Georgetown University Center for Democracy and Civil Society. He was formerly associate professor of political science at Columbia University and director of the Social Science Research Program on International Peace and Security and its program on the Middle East. Our second speaker is Marwa Daoudi, and she's an assistant professor of international relations at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service in Washington. Before she was a departmental lecturer in politics and international relations of the Middle East at St. Antony's College, Oxford, and she was a visiting lecturer in international affairs at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School. Her article, Sectarianism in Syria, Myth and Reality, which appeared in the Open Democracy magazine, is one of the best analyses of the phenomenon of sectarianization, a theme that we will be exploring tonight. And last but certainly not least, Joshua Landis is Associate Professor in the College of International Studies at the University of Oklahoma, where he's also Director of the Center for Middle East Studies. Widely regarded as one of the leading Syria experts in the world, he's the former president of the Syrian Studies Association. He writes and edits Syria Comment, a daily blog on Syria that attracts over 100,000 page reads a month and is widely read by officials in the Middle East, Europe, Washington, and beyond. And he's regularly interviewed on Syria on PBS, NPR, the BBC, Al Jazeera, and he's quoted regularly in the New York Times and the Washington Post. The format for tonight is we've asked our speakers to speak for approximately 15 minutes each on the announced topic. There will be a panel discussion that I will moderate after the presentations are over, exploring some of the questions, and then we'll turn it over to questions and answers from the audience. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming our three guests here to the University of Denver.
Nader, thank you very, very much for that introduction, and my thanks as well to Professor Postal for inviting me to come out here to the University of Denver for this panel this evening. When Nader mentioned that the center had been in existence for only 2 years, I have to say I was a little bit surprised. I was surprised because in a very short time, Professors Postal and Hashemi, I think, have been extraordinarily successful in turning the center here into a vibrant and very widely known and respected home for interesting conversations about the Middle East. It can't really have been only 2 years. That's quite something. Congratulations. I thought I would begin this evening by asking what might seem to be something of a straightforward question. The Syrian conflict is now in its 4th year. Sectarianism has been one of the issues that has been at the center of conversation about the Syrian conflict for some time. And so, keeping that in mind, I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is what kind of conversation should we be having about sectarianism in the Syrian conflict after 4 years? What kinds of questions should we be asking at this point in the conflict? And I wanted to start with these questions because I think we have to begin any conversation about Syria, about the Syrian conflict, about sectarianism in the Syrian conflict, by acknowledging really first and foremost that today the Syrian conflict has become so deeply sectarian, so intensely sectarian, both in terms of the dynamics that drive the regime and in terms of the dynamics that drive the opposition. It's become so intensely sectarian in the fashion in which it's been integrated into regional alliance networks, in the fashion in which actors in Syria align with various sectarian blocs in the region, that the kinds of questions about sectarianism in Syria that we might have been asking a year ago or 2 years ago, I would argue are really no longer appropriate. The kinds of questions we might have been asking about, for example, whether it might be possible somehow to restore the Syrian conflict to the non-sectarian character that defined it in the very earlier phases of the uprising. Could we go back? Could we find a way back to dynamics in Syria that were less infused with this intense sectarian character? My own sense is that these kinds of questions have today become largely irrelevant. I think we can certainly talk and argue about these questions. I think we can talk and argue about what sectarian polarization might imply for where the Syrian conflict is headed, what its trajectory might look like. We have a lot of data on civil wars. The data that we have tell us that sectarian conflicts last longer. They tell us that sectarian conflicts tend to be more violent. They tell us that sectarian civil wars are much more likely to relapse into violence over time than other forms of civil wars, other forms of violent conflict. So there are certainly questions we can ask given the starting point that I set out. We can debate what sectarian polarization of this intense kind implies about the possibilities for a political settlement of the Syrian conflict. We can talk about what the implications might be for U.S. policy. But in some respects, what I'm trying to argue is that for these conversations to be productive, I think we have to acknowledge the reality that the Syrian conflict today is a consolidated ethno-sectarian civil war. I really don't see any way around that. So that's my starting point. But in taking that starting point, I think we also have to approach it with some care. And I think that in particular, if we accept that as a starting point, it imposes on us a collective obligation not to impose on Syria a simplistic, one-dimensional conception of what sectarianism means or of how identity politics are shaping conflict dynamics in Syria more broadly. There has been an unfortunate tendency, I think, in a lot of the analysis and commentary on Syria to argue, on one hand, that sectarian violence is nothing more than a modern manifestation of ancient hatreds, a phrase that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And because of this, as a result, until these ancient hatreds burn themselves out, there's really very little that the international community can do to affect the course of the conflict in Syria, and is better off staying out. This was the perspective articulated by a researcher at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, Stephen Cook, just a couple of weeks ago in the Washington Post. The argument was basically, because they are fighting over fundamental conceptions of what it means to be Syrian, these are not his words, they're mine, all we do is pull down the shades, walk away until they get tired of killing each other. At that point, we can take a peek behind the curtain and see what might be left. Right? This is sort of the ancient hatreds perspective. We've seen, on the other hand, a tendency in analysis of Syria to argue that sectarian identities are simply being exploited by various actors, typically regional actors, for instrumental purposes. That, in fact, these are not ancient hatreds. That violence in Syria has much more to do with interests than with identities. And that because of this, the conflict in Syria can, in fact, be addressed effectively through standard kinds of interest-based conflict resolution, conflict mediation, and negotiation techniques. Now, to the extent that this latter view, this view about identities as being instrumentally manipulated by actors to the conflict, to the extent that this reflects a view that might be called instrumental constructivism, right? Identities are not given, they're made, they can be exploited for pragmatic purposes. I actually have to say that I find myself slightly more inclined toward this view of sectarian dynamics in Syria, certainly than toward the ancient hatreds perspective. But I make that observation about a relative preference for that way of approaching sectarian dynamics in Syria with two very, very significant cautions, two very significant caveats. First, I think there are real limits to how far we can treat identities in simply instrumental terms. Identities may be subject to being constructed, but not in an unbounded way. And second, I think we have to recognize that once these kinds of identities have become mobilized, we have to be very, very careful about imagining that they can easily be demobilized. Once sectarian identities have become such a critical factor in conflict dynamics, we have to be very careful about assuming that they can easily be turned on and off, that they're so plastic that they can simply be reverse engineered in a very quick or very easy fashion. I think in its own way, this notion of instrumentalism or constructivism is also far too simplistic a way of thinking about identity politics. And in its own way, I think both this view and the view about ancient hatreds lead us to overlook some of the complexities of sectarian dynamics and identity politics in the Syrian conflict. So We certainly need to understand, I would say, the limits of using ethno-sectarian identities as a kind of shorthand for making sense of who's who in the conflict, and how groups are likely to align, and what kinds of relationships they're likely to form. I think we have to recognize that there are Sunni militias fighting alongside the regime. I think we have to recognize that there are non-Sunni, non-Arab Syrians who are aligned with the Syrian opposition. The vice president of the Syrian opposition coalition today is a Kurdish Syrian, for example. We need to be aware that patterns of political affiliation among Kurds and Druze in Syria, a small minority community living mostly in the south, are very, very complex. We need to be aware that population movements have affected Syrian demographics in ways that have significant implications for sectarian relations among Syrians, between internally displaced people, between refugees. We've seen significant shifts in demography in Syria with sectarian implications. And I think we can keep these complexities in view. We can keep in mind how dynamic and complex sectarian dynamics are in Syria at any given moment, even while we acknowledge that the kind of familiar patterns that we often see reported in the press about sectarian dynamics, in particular about the divide between Sunnis and non-Sunnis, do indeed tell us something important about how violence is organized in the Syrian conflict. It tells us something important about how local actors connect to regional counterparts. It tells us something about how parties to the conflict view what is at risk for them in the violence that's unfolding, and so on. In other words, I think we have to recognize that we can understand identities as constructed on one hand, but as meaningful categories for defining how people relate themselves to this conflict on the other at the same time. They're not exclusive, they're not incompatible, but in order to get a handle on these dynamics, I think we have to keep both of these features of sectarianism in Syria in mind. And for all of these reasons, from my perspective, it seems to me that rather than debating how sectarian the Syrian conflict has become, whether it is really sectarian or simply subject to the manipulation of outsiders or not, that these are not really the questions that are important. I think there are other questions we need to address to understand where sectarian polarization is going, to where the conflict in Syria might be headed, and to understand whether sectarian polarization can possibly be reversed at some point in the future. And there are two questions in particular that I want to try and address before I wrap up. The first, and Nader hinted at that, is this question about what's driving sectarian polarization in Syria. What are the real causes of sectarian polarization? Is it principally the result of external intervention by sectarian regional actors like Iran, Hezbollah, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, other actors in the region? Or is it largely a product of internal factors, of internal drivers and dynamics? Now, it's not easy to separate the two. They're very clearly connected. There are ties between internal actors and external actors. But my sense is that if we can identify one set of factors as the principal driver of sectarian polarization, we'll have some useful clues about where the conflict is headed. We'll have some useful clues about the potential for reversing sectarian trends at some point in the future. And so which of these directions, external, internal, should we think about as most important in understanding sectarian polarization in Syria? There's a very active debate about this among scholars of Syria, among researchers. Personally, I tend to agree with the views of a Belgian scholar named Thomas Pierret. Thomas has argued that sectarian polarization is principally the result of the intentional policies of the Assad regime And he goes on to make the somewhat more controversial argument, which I also think has some merit, and we can talk about it during the Q&A if it's of interest, that regional actors, including some that we most closely associate with sectarian radicalization, like Saudi Arabia, like Iran, are actually quite acutely aware of the risks of sectarian extremism in the Syrian case, increasingly so over time, and are taking steps to try to temper sectarian extremism in the Syrian case. And again, we can talk about that more as we move forward. If I had to draw any kind of conclusions from this observation, it would be a somewhat pessimistic one. If we accept that sectarianism is being driven principally as a result of internal factors, I suspect that processes of sectarian reversal will be that much harder. I suspect that if sectarianism were being driven from the outside, it might be somewhat easier to step back from, but given the internal dynamics, I suspect it will turn out to be more durable. And this gets us to the second question about whether sectarian polarization has permanently transformed the Syrian political landscape. Is it the case that sectarian cleavages are redefining Syrian politics in ways that are going to be relevant, not just for months or years to come, but for decades, for generations to come? Or, on the other hand, is it possible that we can imagine a future for Syria in which sectarian polarization might not be such a critical defining feature of the Syrian political landscape? And on this score, I have to say that my inclination, at least for now, is to be somewhat cautiously pessimistic. If there's a pessimistic undertone to my comments, you're not wrong. Yeah, you're picking that up. I would argue that the prospects for overcoming sectarian polarization are limited. I'd say they're constrained, and I'd say they're very, very highly time sensitive. On the positive side, I think it's still the case today that patterns of sectarian affiliation, especially among some of the armed opposition groups, tend to be based far more on instrumental calculations than they are on ideological commitments to extremism. It continues to be the case that fighters who align with extremist groups do so because those groups provide salaries, weapons, ammunition, not because they're believers in the mission of those groups. However, whether instrumental convictions can become ideological convictions over time seems very plausible to me. So the longer this conflict goes on, it seems, to me at least, that the less likely it is that fighters who may have affiliated with extremist groups out of instrumental reasons will not absorb ideological commitments that will make it much harder to turn them away from a more sectarian, more extremist path. In terms of the regime, I think as far as the regime is concerned, there continue to be very, very powerful incentives to exploit sectarian tensions. There's been a very, very deep consolidation of political power along sectarian lines in regime-held areas of Syria. However, it continues to be true that the Assad regime provides over a population that still is, if not majority Sunni, then very heavily Sunni. And if the Assad regime imagines restoring any degree of normalcy in the territory that it controls, it's going to have to find a formula, no matter how contrived that formula might seem, to provide space for the inclusion of Sunnis at one point or another. I think it will be very difficult to exclude and repress Syrians living within the Assad regime's territory indefinitely. And I think this also runs counter to the view that sectarian polarization and sectarian extremism are permanent features of the Syrian political landscape. But, and I'll close with this, whether Syria heads down this more optimistic path of sectarian accommodation at some point in the future, I think is contingent on factors that are in many ways beyond the control of either the regime or the opposition. including factors like the emergence of ISIS as a dominant military force on the battlefield. And I think we have to recognize that the more likely outcome, barring any near-term political settlement of the conflict, recognizing how remote a political settlement of the conflict is today, this more likely outcome, I would argue, is one in which sectarian divides are going to continue to drive political dynamics, conflict dynamics in Syria into the foreseeable future. And, as we see with ISIS today, could very well end up creating near insurmountable barriers to either the social, the economic, or the political reintegration of Syria as an integral state, and I think could end up prolonging the conflict, prolonging violence for some time to come. So, in keeping with the overall pessimistic outlook that I have expressed this evening, I'm afraid I will end on a note which suggests that despite the presence of possibilities to mitigate and even roll back sectarian polarization, I think the likelihood that those possibilities will be realized in the near term are fairly small. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I too would like to thank my fellow speakers and thank both Danny and Nader for inviting me back to this beautiful town, beautiful university, and a fantastic center. I'm a historian, I guess I'm the historian in this crowd, and so I'd like to give a little historical perspective to religious communalism in the Levant writ large, the Middle East. And I'd like to make the argument that Ottoman era, 19th century, 18th century communalism, religious communalism, has been transformed by nationalism and the growth, the spread of nation states and the need to develop a national community in these nation states, the successor states to the Ottoman Empire. And that nationalism that spread through the Middle East has transformed religion. And today, the dominant form of nationalism in the Middle East is inflected with religion. The secular nationalism of the post-war periods, the Nassers, the Ba'ath Party, the Tunisian of Bourguiba, the Algerians, that secular nationalism is gone. And today you have religious nationalism, whether it's Iranian type or Saudi type or the Morsi in Egypt, you have this old secular nationalism being challenged. And of course, the old secular nationalism in countries like Syria was not very secular, as I hope to point out. But there's been a transformation of religious communalism. And I think the Middle East is going through today, or at least the Levant part, what I've called the great sorting out. And I've compared this to Central Europe during the Second World War. If we look, for example, at the spread of nationalism, which is a modern idea, French Revolution, America, the beginnings of nation states. Before that, the globe is covered with bishoprics, free cities, kingdoms, empires, you name it, tribal organizations, every kind of political organization known to man, but not nation states. The nation state is new. Today we have 193. It's like cookie cutters around the globe. Either you belong to one, in which case you're got it made, but if you don't, you're a refugee, you've got nothing. And creating that cookie cutter Middle East nation state has been, and Central Europe, has been a bloody, and is an ongoing bloody process of sorting out peoples to fit these national borders. Because the First World War, when so many of these nation states were created, as you can see here, the empires destroying war. Russian Empire, German Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire, all destroyed. Paris Peace Conference creates this big sort of like pearls on the floor, all these new nation states. It doesn't change and sort the people out to fit the borders it's created. The multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies of the Habsburg Empire, Poland, Ukraine, Czechoslovakia, and the Ottoman lands, Syria, Iraq, so forth, are left with all these different peoples living cheek by jowl, many of them not really wanting to live together, not knowing how to live together, and told you're going to form an organic community on the nation state. And so good in Europe until the Second World War. When Poland, 64% Poles before the Second World War, 100% Polish just about by the end of the Second World War. Czechoslovakia, 23% minorities before the war. By the end, almost all those minorities had been wiped out. And that's the case right down Central Europe. Of course, Yugoslavia held on under Tito, but in the 90s, once Tito was dead, boom, 7 nation states in Yugoslavia, lots of bloodletting and reorganizing. We're watching Ukraine divide up along the Russian-Ukrainian line, of course. And after the Second World War, 13 million Germans were ethnically cleansed between 1945 and 47 from all those Central European states. They were the guilty minority. They had helped Hitler occupy these countries. The Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia, the Polish Germans, they were all wiped out. Even in a little country, in a little area like the Crimea, 6% German. Hitler occupied it in the war. When the Russians liberated it at the end, all those 6% Germans, gone. Because they had helped Hitler, or at least that was the accusation. So what happens in the Levant, in the Ottoman postlands? Here is Anatolia, the great nationalist revolution of the Turks. Let's say we take 1914, the beginning of the First World War, to 1923 when war stops. 20% Christian, Anatolia, 1914. By the end of this war, they're almost all gone. Today, it's less than 1% Christian. The Armenians, you know about, 1.5 million killed, driven out. Why? Because they were accused of being a fifth column, helping the Russians, being disloyal to the Turks. The Greek Orthodox, same thing. 1.5 million Greek Orthodox kicked out of the country. Why? Because Greek invaded, thinking they could rebuild the Byzantine Empire and Christianity in Anatolia. Of course, they were defeated by Ataturk. He unifies Turkey, and he drives them out. And as he drives the Greek army out, he kicks out all Greek Orthodox, whether they had anything to do or not. Confessional, religious communalism becomes nationalism, and it's deadly. Turkey is a Muslim country. Even though it's secular, Islam becomes a defining element of this national identity. And let us switch to Lebanon, our beautiful multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. The French, in most of the Levant, the colonial powers privilege the minorities. They give them a leg up. And so every state in the Levant becomes dominated by a minority at the end of World War II. The Maronite Christians are given the lion's share of power in Lebanon. The presidency, head of the military, 6 out of 11 delegates in the parliament have to be Christian. Of course, they become a minority. By the time of the Lebanese Civil War, the Muslims are 2/3 the population, just about. They want one man, one vote. But the Christians will not let go of power. They dragged their country down into a terrible civil war, 150,000 people killed in 15 years, terrible turmoil out of 3 million. That's because it's a zero-sum game for these minorities. They believe they're going to be marginalized or driven out of the country altogether. They look at Turkey. They look at other places where the national sentiment has destroyed these religious communities. Lebanon, we saw. Iraq. What does America do when they go to Iraq? What America is really doing in Iraq is taking the 20% Sunnis who've dominated politics since the British left. Saddam Hussein, Sunni, the Ba'ath Party, the Iraqi army are instruments of Sunni domination. America takes the Sunnis from the top of society and casts them down to the bottom. Takes the Shiites at the bottom and catapults them up to the top. This major social engineering. The Sunnis immediately join al-Qaeda and other radical groups because their country's been stolen from them, they're marginalized, they feel like they're going to be wiped out. They fight, long and bloody. And they're still fighting today, and they've joined ISIS, and they don't want the sectarian government in Baghdad that America built to dominate them because they feel completely discriminated. And they are. Because Shi'i nationalism is dominant in Baghdad today, and Sunnis don't have a place in it. You can even shoehorn, with a little bit of injustice, the Arab-Israeli conflict in Palestine into this model that I'm creating for you. In 1850, about 4% of the population of Palestine was Jewish. There were about 20,000 Jews in Palestine. By 1914, 14%. By the time the British leave in 1948, a third. There's a Balfour Declaration. Britain protects Palestine for immigration and Zionism. But as soon as the British leave, the Palestinians believe that they're going to be able to beat the Jews and reconquer and take Palestine for themselves. Of course, they're badly mistaken. They get beaten terribly. 800,000 of the 121.2 million Palestinians are driven out of the country, never to be allowed to return and become refugees. We can argue whether that's a form of ethnic cleansing or not, but the point is the Jews, the Jewish minority in Palestine, is able to do something that other minorities are not. Turn itself in from a minority to the majority. Ingathering Jews who are persecuted from around the world and creating a nation state defined by religious identity. Sectarianism. And we can't forget that 50% of those Jews are from the Middle East. The largest single religious community in Baghdad in 1914 was Jewish. Yemen, Damascus, Aleppo. Seinfeld from Aleppo. His grandmother from Aleppo, born in Aleppo. Those Jews are gone today. There aren't any Jews in Syria. Maybe there's 3 or 4 left. From the Middle East, they're gone. They're in Israel. Of course, Israel. At any rate, you can see what I'm getting to here. Long and bloody, the Palestinians have fought back. They don't like to lose. It's a zero-sum game. They've been at war. They're probably not going to get anything. Who knows? Maybe they'll get a state. I don't know. But it's not a good. The precedent is bad. Let's go to Syria, the country of our interest here. Of course, the Alawites are our little minority that are going to be privileged by the French. The French arrived in 1920. The Alawites are the lowest of the low. There is no town in Syria where Alawites and Sunnis live together. The coastal cities, Latakia, Tartus, Jebel Banyas, are Sunni cities with a Christian minority. Alawites live with Ismailis and Christians, but they don't live as Sunnis. There's very dramatic demographic segregation. Alawites cannot give testimony in a court of law under the Ottoman Empire because they're not Muslims. They're not recognized to be Muslims. So they are the poorest of the poor. France creates an army to put down the nationalists, who are largely Sunni Arabs. The Alawites pour into that army. So do Armenians, Ismailis, rural poor Sunnis, anybody who the French, of course they have to be willing to shoot at the nationalists who are making trouble for the French. And the Alawites are happy to do that, by and large. They're getting 3 meals a day. At any rate, by the time the French leave in 46, the Alawites are all over the army. By 1955, we have an estimate that 60% of the non-commissioned officers are Alawite. By 1966, they take over the government in the first Alawite-led coup, and 70, the Assads lock up power. And from then on in, they jealously guard politics in Damascus. 80% of the officer corps, Alawite. The foreign service, probably 80% of the officers are minoritarian. At least that's what one Sunni ambassador who defected to Turkey said, that there was only 20% non-minorities in the foreign service. But the ministries are like that. At the top of the important ministries, Alawites are collected. That's why Assad didn't fall and the army didn't abandon him. It's a sectarian regime, even though it was pretending not to be, under the rubric of Arab nationalism, had made alliances with rural Sunnis and all kinds of other people. But today, you can see it fairly starkly. The minorities clinging to the coattails of this Assad-led regime, fearful that Islamists will drive them out Let me just, how did this regime become so minoritarian too? The minorities decide to take over the regime in the 1960s when Nasser ruled Syria. He sends most of the minority officers, like Hafez al-Assad, Omran, the others, Jadid, who take over later, into exile in Egypt because he doesn't trust them in Syria. They form a secret military committee while they're in Egypt and say, these Sunnis, they don't trust us, we've got to stick together. And they do in these secret committees, and they come to power this way. And you can see how Nasser's radio, in 1954, when the Druze made some trouble against Shishak, their radio is pumping out this stuff like, the Druze are a sect, they are not Arab. They are not Arab in any way. The Druze hate the Arabs. The Druze have their own beliefs. They are servants of the British and Jews in Israel. The Druze are traitors, enemies of Islam, friends of Israel. This is the kind of propaganda being pumped out. So the minorities are fearful of this Sunni chauvinism of Nasserism. And they decide to take power for themselves. And this kind of sectarianism snowballs. Let me just flip over to, well, I'm not going to get into the different forms of sectarian nationalism, but even a greater Syria notion, started by Anton Sada and so forth. The Greek Orthodox had their idea of what the national identity should be of this whole region. Secular, Syrian, pro-French, because they didn't want the Muslims from the Hijaz. They didn't want Faisal and other people coming up and ruling them. They didn't want Arabs, who they worried would be too Islamist, ruling over Syria. We can see this sectarianism deeply embedded. Bashar al-Assad's father, in this famous Musbata petition sent to the French, 36, says the Alawite nation refuses to be annexed to Muslim Syria. They have a separate quasi-independent state under the French. The French are about to sign an agreement with the nationalists in Damascus, unifying Syria, placing the Alawite ethnic enclave under the rule of the Sunnis. Most Alawites are apoplectic, very anxious. They're worried about Sunni domination. And he writes, because the Islamic religion is thought of as the official religion of the country and the Alawite nation is thought of as heretical by the Islamic religion, therefore we ask you to consider the dreadful and terrible fate that awaits Alawites if they are forced to be annexed to Syria. They plead, don't do it. Of course, France leaves and they do it. In the US archives, there's a letter from the governor of Latakia, Sunni governor, 1947. And he tells the American representative in Damascus, there is not one Alawite administrator in the province of Latakia by 1947. Within 2 years, the entire province had been run by Alawites under the French. All the administrators were gone and were run by Sunnis and Christians within 2 years. So the Alawites were not completely stupid. They don't get massacred, but their anxieties were fulfilled to a little degree. Now let's look for 2 seconds at what sectarianism is, how it's defined in Syrian textbooks, in Syrian schools. This is the Islamic, every student has to study Islamic religion in Syrian schools for all 12 years. The Christians, about 5% of Syria, go to Christian classes and study Christian religion during these class periods. But Muslims go to the Islam class. And it says, well, the school text blames sectarianism on non-Muslims. The texts decry ta'ifiyya, or sectarianism, and they insist that Islam is the best and most complete religion. They blame Christians and Jews for failing to recognize the true faith. This says, here's a passage from the 9th grade textbook. Faith in all the prophets and divine books ends hateful religious and sectarian divisions. The reason for sending different prophets in different ages was to gradually prepare humanity to accept religion and to be able to discern the most complete religious message, which is Islam. The reason for this was not to spread the spirit of division between the people, because God definitely did not intend that. In other words, he's saying that Moses was sent down with Judaism and the Old Testament as a 101 religion. Then we upgraded with Jesus and the Bible. You get a 2.0. And everybody's supposed to hit the, reboot button on their computer. And then Islam comes down with 3.0 and Muhammad, the seal of the prophets, and you're supposed to get to the final version. And the reason there's sectarianism is because there are Jews and Christians who refuse to hit the reboot button. And they're arrogant and refusenicks. And that's the reason. It makes total sense. That's what Christians said about Jews for thousands of years. They didn't get with a program and push 2.0 and believe in Jesus. And Jews were persecuted. Let's look at a more important passage for Alawites, pagans. What do you do with pagans? Because Alawites in Islamic theology are pagans. They deify Ali. It says, Islam must fight these two belief systems because they are an assault to both instinct and truth. They contradict the principle of freedom of belief. This is because, quote unquote, Islam gives freedom of belief. 1 minute, this is my last passage. Islam gives freedom of belief only within the limits of the divine path, which means a religion descended from heaven. And Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all descended from heaven. God sent them down at different times with different prophets. Now, how should Muslims deal with these people who comprise half of humanity, the pagans and atheists, who are the other half of humanity? There is a subsection in the 9th grade textbook. It's called Islam Fights Paganism and Atheism. And it says, Islam accepts only two choices for pagans, that they convert to Islam or be killed. Now, this is important because the Yazidis are pagans. And when ISIS, claiming to be the true fundamentalists, arrive and capture the Yazidis, they have a crisis on their hands. They've caught all these pagans who are Zoroastrians. What do you do with them? Well, it's in their 9th grade textbook. It says convert them or kill them. What did they do? They followed the textbook. They lined them up and convert them. You can go to YouTube and see thousands being converted. And they have to say, obviously they're doing it at the point of a gun, but most of them are running away because they don't want to do this. But they're only following what's in the textbooks in Syria today. This is, I don't know how we should define sectarian, religious communalism. The trouble with Assad is that he is, like the Yazidis, a pagan. If he loses power, he will be defined as a pagan, like the Yazidis. If you take one look at, for example, the Islamic Front, the most mainstream, centrist, and biggest and most powerful militia coalition in Syria, Zahran al-Lush, the leader of the Islamic army, gave a big speech not too long ago out at the Umayyad desert castles, and he said, we're going to bring back the Umayyad Empire, and Shiites and Alawites, who he calls Majus, need to be tadhir, purified from the land. Get rid of them from all of Syria. They're pagans. He gives this speech right out of the textbook. This sectarianism, as Stephen has said, has gone to the point where it's hard to put it back. It's hard to know how you can denature this, because it's taken hard lines. Tehran supporting the Shiite, the Alawites. Tehran, a city of 10 million people, more than that, not one Sunni mosque. There are millions, probably 1 million Sunnis in Tehran. Not one Shiite, not one Sunni mosque in all the city. In Saudi Arabia, the biggest funder of the rebels, not one Shiite mosque in Mecca, not a church in Saudi Arabia. These are very sectarian countries, both of them. And they're weighing in, and they're defining national identities, helping to define them along these very strict sectarian lines. America is in Baghdad trying to convince the Iraqi sectarian government it's established not to be sectarian, to embrace the Sunnis and to rebuild a secular Iraqi nationalism as the way to stop ISIS. It's not going to happen, I don't think. It's too late. I'll leave you there. Thank you.
Good evening. The Middle East is increasingly experiencing the language of minority, majority, and sectarianism is emerging at the forefront of political discourse, media attention, and much of the debate surrounding Syria's descent into war. One urgently needs to revisit the uncritical primordialist accounts of the country's past, present, and future. And this is why I would like to thank very sincerely Professor Hashmi and Professor Postel for organizing this event, firstly, and for inviting me here around the project of nuancing these issues, revisiting them, and getting beyond these primordialist accounts of identity and sects, and also for inviting me for the first time to Denver University and to Denver itself, which is a lovely city. There is a need, in my view, to oppose a master narrative around the idea of sectarianism to a homegrown, powerful counter-narrative, which was born out of the Arab Spring and the Syrian revolution since 2011. It's the idea of sectarianism versus political change, justice, dignity. How can we define sectarianism, ta'ifiyya? Well, acting or causing action on the basis of membership of a specific religious community, the idea of communal solidarity, and in parallel, of course, it's the much debated discussion around identity politics. I would caution everyone and the discussion around the conflict in Syria to be analyzed only as a sectarian-based war and only with reference to civil wars, and I will explain why during my presentation. Syria is indeed a country of multi-layered identities and hubs of interdependent networks. It's a mosaic of ethnic and religious identities, which makes it a very particular society and country for those of us and of you who have been there or have grown up there. Of course, there has been sectarian favoritism and solidarity under the Ba'athist rule, and it was politically and socially motivated. And of course, today, there is a sectarian dimension to the conflict in Syria. But I will argue that it's the result of the politics of sectarianization, and this is the title that you chose, Nader and Danny, which I think is very accurate. It's about sectarianization that followed the Syrian revolution, that responded to the nonviolent and armed resistance in Syria, and later on to the insurgency and counterinsurgency by internal and external actors. What are these politics of sectarianization? Well, clearly, internal actors have played a role, and it started from there. The current rebellion and the revolution and everything that happened since 3 years in Syria was not driven by religious motives and sectarian hatred. On the one hand, it was not a Sunni rebellion against the minority-led government. It was a Syrian revolution, and it was about the divide between the haves and the haves-not, mainly in the poor and neglected rural areas of Syria. It is important to outline also that there has been a long-standing tradition in Syria also of secular opposition, all communities represented, including Alawites, inside and outside the country. It is true, however, that we have seen an increasingly Islamized armed resistance to the regime inside the country, which has evolved since a while into transnational jihadism. Many within the resistance, the armed resistance, have turned to Islam to draw strength and mobilization, or possible funding as well by external actors. Many are faithful Muslims. They are not necessarily radicals. But it's important to outline also that the regime's strategy was to bring confrontation onto its favorite ground early on since the start of the peaceful protests, the military and the sectarian conflict. It presented itself as a protector of so-called minorities and a champion of secularism and resistance throughout the region. The borders with Iraq were made porous. for the return of the Sunni extremists who had been fighting the US-led occupation of Iraq. And I think one cannot understand what happened in Syria without taking into account the Iraqi scenario, what happened in neighboring Iraq. And these were later joined by offshoots of Al-Qaeda and then transformed into the Islamic State. The idea, of course, then took momentum of its own in discourses and in practices. What about the external actors? I think it's very important to focus on these actors as well. The geopolitical struggles have been transferred to Syria and have transformed the nature and the scope of the revolution. The lines today are also blurred within the so-called sectarian groups or sectarian formed groups between the Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham. They're all Sunnis. They're funded by rival Sunni Gulf states, and they're still fighting also each other. So how can sectarianism explain this internal struggle? Now, the term of civil war usually relates to a war between opposing groups of citizens of the same country. This term can reflect what is happening in Syria because we are having citizens within Syria fighting each other. It, however, dilutes also the importance of how all of this started by peaceful protest, revolution of civilians, of citizens against their regime, and also by a revolution which continues today to be crushed. The focus is on IS, the focus is on the Islamists. There are still citizens fighting the regime, and they are not Islamists, they're just Syrian citizens. It's an endogenous civilian movement which continues, as I said, to be brutally repressed, and also the fact that there are multiple actors and multiple interests and conflicts confined within that internal conflict. It's now an intractable and protracted geopolitical conflict, crystallizing all of the rivalries, the regional and international rivalries between the US, Russia, and China, the regional powers, the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states versus Iran, Turkey in the background, Israel as well, etc., etc. The Islamization of the conflict has started because of foreign support from regional governments, the Arab Gulf states, and also non-state organizations and individuals in empowering these Islamist groups. This sectarianization is also in the interest of the global jihadists at the first hand. As you all know, the Islamic State was mainly an Iraqi-born movement, Al-Qaeda-related movement from Iraq, born out of resistance to the Anglo-American occupation, even if IS has put as its spokesman a Syrian, Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, who has in fact lived most of his life in Anbar in Iraq. I traveled recently to the region, and I went to Lebanon, to the border with Syria, and I interviewed many of the refugees, but also activists who had fled the country. And in carrying these interviews, I asked all of the people, the young activists, and some turned out to be fighters who had been wounded and were going to Lebanon to get healed and go back to fight. And I realized that after talking to them. And I asked them, one of my questions was, do you think you are fighting a sectarian war? And astonishingly, most of the people I interviewed said no. And I'm talking about people, defectors from the army, who had been detained, tortured, who had suffered at the hands of the regime. And some of them also, astonishingly, belonged to the minority. Some were Ismailis from Salmieh. And they clearly said, no, this is a fight that we see as a national Syrian fight. The only ones who told me, yes, this is a sectarian war, turned out to be with what they called the Islamic State. And my interviews were in the beginning of June, before the proclamation by Baghdadi of the Islamic State. And at the time, I told them, do you mean Daesh, the Arabic acronym for it? And they refuted it. They said, there's no such thing as Daesh. It is the Islamic State. These were the ones who talked about sectarian war. They turned out to come from Al-Midan neighborhood in the heart of Damascus. And they talked to me reciting sentences And, their main target was the Shias. That's what they were saying. And I felt in the background, although they didn't want to say it, was about Iran. Today, Syria is sacrificed to regional and international interests. And in my view, the US airstrikes aimed at the Islamic State and Oslo Jabhat al-Nusra will not be successful in somehow changing the equation because of the toll, the civilian casualties, and also by the lack of clarity in that sense. Are we fighting only the Islamic State, and what about the regime's action against its own citizens, which is not really tackled nor addressed, but this is another debate. As a result, today, there is a political, social, and humanitarian catastrophe happening in Syria. The death toll is close to between 160,000 to 200,000 Syrians killed, about 10,000 children killed, 9 million displaced, amongst whom 50,000 Palestinians from Syria who have been displaced again. It's their second or third exile, mainly from the Yarmouk camp in Damascus. And other groups such as the Armenians are also part of the exiles. There's a report which came out from ESQA recently giving very gloomy figures. The food prices in Syria have increased by 107% since 2010. 50% of the households have been destroyed. 4 million people are under the poverty line, which is about 18% of the population, and the GDP has decreased by 16% since 2010. And another tragedy, which is not often spoken about, is the problem of education. Primary education enrollment has dropped from 90% to 70%. As a result, the Syrians have lost their agency. They are not able to call the shots. They are not able to get out of that situation. However, I will argue that they are able to define their identity. And identity is about defining yourself in relation to others. It's also about self-definitions. Identity has historically been a driver of change. And I will argue that the primary determinants of identity have been history and geography. And I will go back to the historical part as well. Primary determinants of identity making and also unmaking. And one cannot understand sectarianization or the rise of sectarianism without relating to these two important variables. And that also allows us to nuance sect or belonging or sectarianism as the sole explanatory variable for understanding everything that is happening in Syria today. If we turn to geography, you could argue it's as much about localism and regionalism, what is happening in Syria. They are religious, but they're also tribal, linguistic, differences across the country. And if you think about regionalism or iqlimiya in Arabic, it's about acting or causing action on the basis of a specific regional origin. In Syria, the rural versus urban divide has been a long-standing feature. There are also major agro-cities. So we could also develop a narrative looking at it from that perspective instead of looking at sects. You look at different regions, Damascus, Suwaida, Daraa, Quneitra in the south, Aleppo, Deir ez-Zor in the northeast, Hama, Homs, and Latakia in the center and northwest. And in all of these regions, I would argue that the geographical identities are also at play. And the lines are also blurred here as you have rural exodus to the cities and people mingle. But we could also have a geographical analysis of the situation. And I will not get into the tribal analysis as well. What about history? I agree that historical formation of the state is an essential part of any understanding of Syria's politics. The links between state formation, nationalism, and I would argue also secularization. Of course, there is the significance of the religious community as the political and social units continue to be prominent. But there has also been state building in Syria within a very fragmented society. And nationalism or Arabism has bridged the communal cleavages between Sunni Arab majority and the mosaic of Arab minorities throughout the history of Syria. It has taken place from above and in response to external pressures such as colonialism, imperialism, mandates, But it has also helped in forging national identity based on historic rights and by rejecting the partitions imposed by colonialism. And by secularization, I will mean the breaking power of away from the power of the religious authorities such as the ulamas and others. The rise of nationalism has weakened sectarian, regional, and tribal ties in Syria. And it's interesting and important to note also that many of the thinkers and founders of Arabism and nationalism were Syrians and Lebanese of Christian descent. And they really pushed for this supra-state, sort of regional identity beyond the cleavages. They all strongly identify with a shared identity based on common history and language. In Syria, what is interesting is this overlap between the suprastate Arab identity and the Syrian identity as well, which found its expressions across regions and times. And it was also the case, interestingly, for many of the so-called minorities, such as Armenians who fled to Syria from Turkey, or the Kurdish population, which of course was neglected in the Arab identity, but included in the Syrian identity in that sense. The Arab Spring has had a dual effect, a feeling of shared public Arab space through satellite TV, but also combined with state-centric grievances, really localized within each of the countries. And I would argue that the term minority is a term which has been also very much used in parallel to the debate on sectarianism and the politics of identity. Minorities, the concept has been constituted by external power as divisions imposed to hinder the appeal of nationalism outside of the driving group. And I will refer you to a very interesting book by a British scholar, Benjamin White, who's opened the French archives to look at what the French mandate did in Syria. And he in fact looks at the concept of minority as a slippery concept that the French used or created, in fact, the minorities to offset the opposition of the nationalist majority. I would argue this is the same thing happening today with the word sectarianism, which is also being sort of imposed on the narrative. What is important also to note is that despite the French attempts at creating territorial, political, and legal divisions, the consolidation of nation-state form in Syria and a national identity were successful and still could be revived, in my view, if we want to think about the future. I would conclude by saying there is a new struggle for Syria to sort of resonate with Patrick Seal's thesis, the struggle for Syria, but in my view, it's a struggle for the ideological orientation of the conflict. Is it secular? Is it Islamist? Is it pro-Iran? Is it pro-Saudi Arabia, pro-Qatari? Is it about inter-Gulf rivalries, but also inter-Gulf Arab rivalries? And the real divide is not religious or sectarian, but geopolitical. And there's a great game which is being played in the region, but which is mainly being played in Syria. As I said, the Syrians have lost their agency. They are no more able to think about ways of getting out of the current tragedy that is being experienced by all of them since 3 years, inside and outside. They still retain the capacity to define their struggle in the future and their identity. And in my view, the solutions to end the current tragedy have to be sought by keeping the country's once cohesive national identity, territorial integrity, and independence. Am I hopeful in the short term? No, I'm very pessimistic in the short term. I am optimistic in the long term, especially after having met these young activists who had fled the country, had been tortured, and kept very much a strong national identity and a lot of resilience as well. And this is where my hope lies for the future of the Syrians and of Syria as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, I have a question for each of our panelists. I want to pose it, one question each, and then invite the other members, if they want to weigh in on the question, to comment. And then we will go to the question and answer session for audience participation. First question to Stephen Heydemann. In a report that you authored in May of 2013 on sectarianism in the Levant, you write that sectarianization in the Levant has been underway for decades, but it really gained momentum as we entered the new millennium. In the year 2000, the rise of Saudi Arabia as a regional actor, the rise of Turkey, the rise of more conservative factional politics in Iran have given new intensity to this whole set of regional rivalries and alliances. Could you walk us through the process in terms of putting more meat on the bone, so to speak, in terms of how this actually has been playing out?
Speak to that now? Or?
Yeah, to speak to it now, and then the other panelists can weigh in on it. Yeah, it's working.
I think we saw in the very early 2000s, I think we saw in the very early 2000s a number of factors that contributed significantly to the consolidation of sectarian frameworks as the organizing channels for regional interactions, regional power politics, regional balance of power competition in ways that were quite distinct relative to earlier periods. And there were three factors in particular that I think make an especially significant difference. The first is the election in 2002 of the Justice and Development Party in Turkey, which brought to power a party which was seen at the time, and indeed was at the time, quite moderate in its Islamist orientation, but which nonetheless represented a very sharp break, very clear departure from the far more secular orientation of the governing parties in Turkey which had preceded it. Second, in the 2000s, we saw the accelerating shift of diplomatic and economic influence and resources and power toward the Arab East, toward the Gulf in particular. We saw a decline in the role of some of the conventional, of some of the Arab states that had played a leading role in regional diplomacy, exerted enormous regional influence in the period going all the way back to the 1950s, in particular Egypt, but also Syria, and to some extent Iraq as well, for various reasons. Egypt, because of the residual effects of the Camp David peace process, a general turning inward as questions about the future of Egyptian politics trumped issues that might have drawn Egypt or sustained Egypt's role as a regional power. We had the increasing presence of Qatar based on its newly found oil wealth as a significant regional player. We had Iraq undergoing extraordinary sanctions and isolation as a result of the 1991 Iraq War. So in a variety of ways, what we saw was the increasing consolidation of emergent powers within the Eastern Arab world, all of which gave this new intensity to trends that tended to define regional issues in increasingly sectarian terms. So those were the kinds of things, Nader, that I had in mind when I mentioned that.
Marwa or Josh, did you want to weigh in on that or add anything?
I'm good. I mean,
Okay.
the classic description of rise of religious...
Microphone, yeah.
Oh, well, I forgot one other thing, I'm sorry. The U.S. invasion of Iraq.
Right.
Which had a transformative effect on sectarian balance of power relations in the region, and in many ways has to be seen as a trigger for a lot of the trends that followed. So you had the AKP elected in 2002, the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, a variety of factors, the continuing marginalization of Egypt as a presence. I mean, these things came together in ways that created conditions that were enormously conducive to the growing importance and influence of sectarian frameworks for the organization of regional relationships.
The only thing I would add is that with the defeat and the increasing barbarism of things like Nasserism, the Ba'ath Party in the 60s, we see the rise of Islamist parties. In Egypt in the 70s, we just had dinner with this, I've forgotten your name? Abdullah, who's written a beautiful book on Egypt in the 70s, and the growth of Islamic politics. We see the Iranian Revolution in 79, rise of Hezbollah in 82. You see a growing parties that put religion at the center of their definition. And increasingly, the secular parties of the post-Second World War period become atrophied and don't hold sway. So the Iranian Revolution, the Saudis become to the center of the stage. And then America really destroys, in Iraq, one of the last of these Ba'athists. I mean, good to get rid of them, but on the other hand, you open up the doors of Pandora's box to this Islamism and Shiite sectarianism. And that's now gone into Syria. And
I'll go back to for me, the turning point is the Iraq War and the US and Anglo invasion and occupation of Iraq, which somehow was followed afterwards by the sectarian politics of the Iraqi government towards its own population, which somehow also triggered this rise of sectarianism throughout the country, and then it spilled over to Syria. I would also say the unintended consequence of the Iraq war and invasion was the rise of Iran as a regional power. And that was really not intended by the American government at the time, but that sort of started off an escalating game with the Arab Gulf states. And this is where I would, in my view, place the main lines and the divides. It's between this rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which then took, a sectarian sort of tone.
Great, okay. Question for Josh Landis. I want to pick up on something that you talked about tonight. You've stated that we are witnessing the rearrangement of the populations in the region to better fit the nation states that were fixed after World War I. Some new borders are being drawn, such as those around the Kurdish regions in Iraq and perhaps Syria, but mostly what we are seeing is the ethnic cleansing of much of the region to fit the borders. To fit the borders. And this sort of speaks to this debate that has been around for a while but has been amplified over the summer with the rise of ISIS, that the old Sykes-Picot post-World War I borders no longer are viable, that they are changing whether we like it or not, and perhaps they have to change. This is something that's been part of the debate. I'm deeply skeptical about that possibility. I tend to see the borders as fixed whether we like it or not, maybe perhaps in one case around the Kurdish areas. I just don't see the borders changing in the Middle East as a way of perhaps solving this problem of sectarianism, largely because there's no global support anywhere to recognize new states from the remnants of the post-World War I borders. What's your take on it?
well, I agree with you. I don't think they're going to change a lot. I mean, look at ISIS. ISIS has tried to change the borders and create a Sunni state stretching from Baghdad to Damascus that would incorporate the non-Shiite populations. I mean, Damascus and Baghdad, two sectarian Shiite regimes backed by Iran and, of course, America in Baghdad. And so the Sunnis have tried to carve out their own region for self-determination, the Islamic State. We're going to destroy that, right? We want to keep the Sykes-Picot line. And we've got the whole world marshaled in order to bomb them into smithereens and divide those tribes again along that line of the Iraq-Syrian border. And I suspect we'll probably be, we've got enough bombs to do it. Do I think it's a good idea? No. I mean, I don't. I think it's a good idea to attack ISIS, but we're not going to give anything to the unjustly persecuted Sunnis in the middle. And that's the problem with the entire Obama process. We claim we're going to arm up the rebels to take over something. I don't believe it. We're giving them $500 million. $500 million is pocket change. We've spent $3 billion on Syria since the beginning of this war. That's half the amount of spending of 1 week in Iraq at the height of the occupation. We're not going to change anything for $3 billion or even $6 billion. You need hundreds of billions of dollars to affect a change in Syria. And nobody's going to spend that. So it's a lot of hot air about this and that and, you know, partners and schmartners. We're going to bomb the crap out of the people who hurt us, and we're going to leave. And that's what I see coming down the lane for this whole ISIS, this state that's the size of Great Britain that ISIS owns, with over 6 million people inside it, who, of course, are bad news for America. They chopped off 2 American heads, and they deserve to, you know, America's got to. But I don't see Obama doing anything to bring justice to these persecuted people. And the trouble is that we don't want the rebels to win in Syria. Because if they did, they would take over all the cities that are still integral, where people have cars and apartments and flat screen TVs and whatever else they have. There would be millions more refugees. If the rebels, the 1,500 rebel organizations that now crowd the north, were to go to Damascus and Homs and Hama, Latakia on the coast, Jebel Tartus, all the cities that the government still owns, it would be mayhem. There'd be millions of more refugees going to Jordan and Lebanon. Those countries would collapse, and our whole strategy is to contain the violence in Syria. We haven't done a good job of it, but that's the strategy. And so the last thing America's likely to do is arm up rebels to conquer Damascus, a city of 5 million people. So we're stuck. We say we want to help these people, but we don't really want to help them. And we want to kill the people who are trying to kill us, and that's what we're going to end up doing, I think.
Okay, Marwa and Stephen?
I'm based at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, and I want you to know just how welcome the message Josh communicates is in Washington, D.C. Look, I think if we imagine that the only possible strategy for resolving some of the very deep tensions, hatreds, patterns of violence that have emerged in the course of the Syrian civil war, have spilled over Syria's borders into other countries, is the erasure of the boundaries established in 1916, 1918 under Sykes-Picot, and the redrawing of state boundaries in the Middle East, the outcome is very likely to be close to the one that Joshua predicted. I think, however, if we look at possibilities for responding to some of these emergent and increasingly assertive sub-state forms of nationalism, to the demands for political autonomy among growing numbers of sub-state communities organized around identities other than those attached to national state identities. If we think that there are strategies other than redrawing these external state boundaries, then perhaps the range of possibilities becomes larger. What do I mean? Well, we've seen, on one hand, violent strategies for the redrawing, redesign of boundaries internal to an existing state in the Balkans. We've seen a growing interest in a number of countries in the world, ranging from Lebanon to Brazil to other parts of the world, in strategies of decentralized political governance, in which a large range of functions related to responding to local demands, local needs, local priorities are handled at the local level. These formulas don't need to be perfect. The Kurds and the KRG in northern Iraq were never happy with the distribution of oil revenue that they received from the central government. But they managed, nonetheless, to carve out for themselves a political entity that gave them a sense of autonomy. And my impression is that in the Kurdish dictionary, autonomy is defined as sovereignty, but never mind, we'll forget about that as well. But they have managed somehow to establish a political framework that responds to their very deep concerns for self-governance without yet formally breaking the integrity of Iraq's national boundaries. And I tend to think that that kind of strategy may in fact be more likely than the one that was hinted at in Nader's question, in which it was either integral territorial states or the redrawing of state boundaries more broadly. I think there are intermediate strategies. They might not be easy to arrive at. They may emerge de facto as a result of protracted conflict. But we have to recognize that there are a spectrum of options out there, not all of which require the dissolution of the Sykes-Picot boundaries of 1916 to 18.
Go ahead.
To react
Yep.
to that, I think it's very important that the future solutions are found along inclusionary lines. And in that sense, what I mean is that there should be a recognition, and I agree with Steve, it's not necessarily the suprastate dimension, it's within the state, a recognition of cultural, political rights. Different ethnic groups should have this recognition, which hasn't been the case before. However, one should be careful not to find solutions along ethnic lines. And the danger here, when we talk about the Balkans, is that sometimes the Bosnia-Herzegovina model was advocated for Syria. And that model, in fact, implies a sort of separation or partition along ethnic lines. I think this would be highly problematic for Syria, and it's a solution that I would personally not favor at all, recognizing cultural, political, social rights, but not along partition lines, because this is now the discussion about an Alawistan or Sunnistan or maybe a Kurdistan in Syria. I mean, I have a student who's Kurdish from Syria. He's from Aleppo. He told me if there is a Kurdish autonomous entity in the north, what does it mean for me as an Aleppine? I mean, does it mean that I cannot live in Aleppo? I mean, identities are multi-layered, and especially in the case of Syria, everybody has some Kurdish origin, Armenian, Muslim, sometimes mixed Christian, etc., etc. How would you define yourself in that sense? And I believe in the concept of citizenship instead of partition and, ethnic differences.
Thank you. Marwa, keep the microphone because my last question is to you, and in fact, you've anticipated the question in advance. You've written that the way forward lies in de-escalation, in the de-sectarianization of both narratives and practices. How can the current crisis in Syria and the broader region, which is spilled over now from Syria to the broader region, how can it be de-sectarianized? What would it look like? What policies and processes need to happen?
Yeah, I wrote that in July 2013, and that since then a lot has happened. It could be an idealistic stance now, it's wishful thinking, but I think de-escalation would be to sort of have a combination of military and also political solution. I think the US government had the possibility to bring the regime, the Syrian regime, to a political compromise and a solution, and it didn't do it, Geneva and other instances, and especially last year when there was the use of chemical weapons, there was a momentum which was lost, and there could have been a political solution bringing all of the parties together. However, that would be de-escalate, because I don't believe everything will be resolved only through the military solution, and I don't believe, unfortunately, only in the political. I think it will be a combination of both. Now we have a new factor, a new actor, the Islamic State. Is the threat overrated? I don't know. There's a lot of focus on the Islamic State. There are other things happening now in Syria as well. The regime continues to bomb cities, to bomb civilians, and they're not the target of the US strikes, unfortunately. So there's been a sort of like division in the answer and in the way of managing the conflict. So de-escalation would be ideally this. And desectorize, at the time, what I suggested was that there are many groups within Syria who are secular groups. They're not only the Islamist groups. If really there's a fear of the Islamization of the rebels in the Western world, because of course, all of the discussion is and the focus is on US interests. My concern is also about the interests of the Syrian population and the future of Syria, and I'd like the focus to go back to that. And in that sense, desectorization would be to think about it as an entity, to keep the cohesiveness, the national identity, as I mentioned, again recognizing the different, particular identities, giving more recognition than the state has done so far. And these would be the two ideal ways. Are they feasible today? I think in the short term they will be difficult, but possibly if after the airstrikes there's a momentum to put pressure and to really bring the parties to a political solution, I think this is where the US government would have an impact. And I don't believe that airstrikes are the solution. And again, nobody mentions the civilian casualties after these airstrikes in Idlib, in Raqqa, and also it might also turn against the operations, because a lot of the populations now, the population on the ground are thinking that, well, in that case, it's targeting only IS. What about the Assad regime? And they're turning against the American government in that sense.
Okay. Stephen or Josh, if you want to weigh on that last question.
Just very, very quickly, I believe very strongly in citizenship and the equality of citizenship as a fundamental starting point for the reconstruction of an integral, inclusive, participatory Syria. The challenge is how to get there, and how to create a formula that would persuade a sufficient number of actors in Syria that their interests could be sufficiently protected under those kinds of arrangements, that they should now, given what they've experienced in the last 4 years, be prepared to make the compromises necessary to enter into it. I'm afraid that in order to achieve levels of security among communities that feel themselves enormously exposed and enormously threatened, to be able to reach a point at which the reconstruction of some sort of cosmopolitan citizenship might be possible, we will first need to move through a phase in which core security threats, perceptions of vulnerability among communities will somehow need to be ameliorated through political arrangements in which they feel they have a greater degree of control over their own affairs before we can begin working on strategies to knit a broader sense of Syrian national identity back together.
Okay. Josh, did you want to weigh in on that last question?
Well, I don't know how we're going to get back to an integral country. That's the problem. What I think would be in the short-term interest is a ceasefire. And America now has tremendous leverage because our planes are overflying Syria. And we could threaten Assad if he continues to bomb the north, the rebel-held north. And we could threaten rebels if they try to undermine that ceasefire as well. And so America has the ability now to try to come up with a ceasefire. The trouble with a ceasefire is that it divides the country. And a lot of Syrians don't want it. It leaves Assad in control of half the country. And America is opposed to that. And so is much of the Western international community, which has said that Assad has to step aside. So America cannot go ahead and pursue a ceasefire because it would contradict everything with the Geneva process and everything that they have said, that Obama has said, which is Assad has to step down. And yet America's not going to make Assad step down. And we're going to fudge. And that's what we're doing. What we do have is a stalemate that is growing. It would be much better, though, if we could keep Assad from bombing the north and destabilizing the north so that the 1,000 militias that are operating in the north could begin to hopefully form the kind of national community that you're talking about and produce a government that could bring good governance, at least to the north. Because no Syrian, Sunni, Alawite, or Christian in the south is going to want the north rebels ruling them before they can prove that they can govern anything and can unify and to provide services. So if America could help them build that state in the north, and if it were better governance than Assad, then I think all Syrians in the south would want to be part of the north. But until the rebels prove that they can actually govern anything in a reasonable, responsible way, nobody's going to want them in the South. And America's not going to sponsor them taking over the rest of the country if they can't even run the north of the country. So, yes, unity, indivisible, under God, one nation, I believe in it. How do you get there? That's the difficult thing. And whether America should put a ceasefire now in the name of not killing more people, I think is very important, just to stop the violence and allow moderates to come to the fore increasingly, because with the violence, the rebel militia leaders are the ones who hold all the cards, the people with the biggest guns.
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize, but there have been instances where the local populations have administered themselves very successfully. And we're talking about Manbij and other areas who were not protected by the American government or any external power. So it's not like it's either the rebels or the regime, and otherwise it's chaos. There have been instances where cities were liberated, the population took its destiny in its own hands, and it was successful. They administered it.
There's hope.
There is hope, and I think once I think ceasefire is crucial, and for humanitarian reasons as well. It's crucial, and this has been completely forgotten by the international community now, and also the humanitarian disaster has been forgotten by the international community. But I think there is hope in the population, in administration also by this population, and I think that would be the way to move forward. I agree.
Okay. We have approximately 20 minutes for questions and answers. Is there a microphone circulating that can take questions from the audience? I don't think so. Okay. So you just have to speak as loudly as you can, and I will repeat the question if it's not audible, and we will go from there. We'll take a question, Joel, and then Habib, and then at the front, three of them. Yeah, go ahead. We'll do one question at a time, and then we'll grab a few at the end.
I can take a stab at that answer. I have a slightly different conception of sectarianization. I think it is less to do with a particular mode of identity acquiring new importance among a community in which it was previously not present or trivial. There is a British Iraqi scholar named Fanar Haddad who has written a book about transformations in the nature of sectarianism in the Arab world since 2003. Again, thinking of the U.S. invasion of Iraq as a significant trigger. And what he says is that sectarian identities, which have been present throughout the region for decades, had a very, very different kind of valence, a very, very different weight in defining intercommunal relations, in defining state-society relations, in defining how groups conceived of and understood one another, and that it was much more comparable to what we might think of in the United States as a form of hyphenated identity. Irish American, Greek American, Turkish American, both components on either side of that hyphen matter. But they tend to stand for conceptions of identity that are not quite so necessarily, I don't mean to say antagonistic, but in which what it means to enact that identity is framed in terms that are far less divisive, are far less narrowly defined in terms of enactment of religious behaviors, of religious criteria, sectarian criteria for the legitimation of one's standing as a member of that sectarian community. And that what we've seen in Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East over the last 15 years is that modes of sectarian identity expression have become increasingly anchored in criteria that define observance, that define enactment of religious practice, that define expressions of identity that counterpose one community to another in somewhat antagonistic terms as having acquired far more weight than was the case in the past. And I'd encourage you to look at Fanar's work because he talks about, the bottom line is that sectarianism today is not your grandfather's sectarianism. That it's taken on a very different set of meanings, validates or demands a very different set of behaviors from people in the Middle East, the extent to which, for example, Shia publicly participate in Shia religious rituals in order to validate their standing as good Shia within their community, which had never previously been the case. So when I think about sectarianization, this is an important piece of what it means to me, far more than just this all of a sudden the surfacing of sect as an identity framework.
Any other Members of the panel want to comment on that? Okay, let's take another question. Oh, yeah, it was Habib, and then at the front. And then
Why the Westerners came up with the idea of the separation of church and state, and not in the Muslim world. The people who gave the idea of the separation of church and state, they were religious people. John Locke was a religious person. The answer that I was given was that in the Islamic world, the people didn't have the history, a striking history of this sectarian conflict as strong as it was in the Western world during the 30 years old war. Could you please talk about the history of sectarianism in Islam as well?
Absolutely. I think that is the question for the night, in a sense, that there isn't separation between church and state. And when I'm reading those textbook definitions of what sectarianism is and how to deal with people from different sects, we have the same thing, of course, in America. You go to your church or your synagogue or whatever, and you may learn that your neighbor's going to go to hell, right? Because they don't believe in the right God. But in the public sphere, we teach the exact opposite. I spend all my time teaching my kids that man is, equal, right? That's the Constitution of the United States, and that diversity makes us a better place, that we shouldn't get rid of all the, devil worshipers or the people who don't believe in Jesus or other things like that. So we actually, in society, in the public sphere, truth has a little t. Your question was, how do we come up with it? How does Locke, and I think, when you look back, the early modern European, it was extremely bloody. It took hundreds of years of very bloody warfare, and then dispossessing the churches with the French Revolution, and of course Henry VIII in England and so forth, taking all the land away from them and crushing them. I mean, it was a very, it was a very brutal process of putting them under the authority of the state. And in the 30 Years' War, which is sort of, in a sense, I mean, many people have made the analogy of what's going on today between Sunnis and Shiites to the 30 Years' War, and that we're waiting, in a sense, to get to the Peace of Westphalia, where finally Shiites and Sunnis are going to realize they can't kill each other and wipe out heresy, and that they're going to have to find a way to accommodate. And that's the hopeful. I think that is very important, that Saudi Arabia and Iran eventually figure out a way to sit down and denature this, because right now they're pushing out sectarian propaganda that is very hard to compete with. America cannot denature it. Only these countries that are doing this can denature it. And so it's going to take, in a sense, getting to John Locke. But you look and read in the Syrian textbooks, there is nothing about individualism, the rule of law, very little. You're learning about pagans have to be killed or something. It's the exact opposite. You're learning a religious view of the world that is very chauvinistic. And so when the state collapses because of economic mismanagement, increasing poverty, bad governance, as in a place like Syria, people are at a loss. And they don't go to John Locke because they've never heard of him. They don't go to individualism. They go to what they've heard of and what's in their textbook and what's in their mosques. And that is highly sectarian today. So people are using the resources they have. And I think that, the Enlightenment, in a sense, we're seeing a struggle for identity in the Middle East, whether it's in Egypt or Tunisia, that is all grappling with the central issue of how do we adjudicate religion and truth, God, in our state, in our politics. How do we say that you can have a different belief about God and not demonize you? And that is a very difficult thing to do. It took the West hundreds of years to do it. And I think the Middle East is grappling with those very essential questions that you just brought up. And I don't know, I think there are many intellectuals in the Middle East that are preaching this kind of Enlightenment stuff. But it's only penetrated, I don't know how much, what percentage, but it isn't. You look at the bottom, where all these militias are forming, highly sectarian.
Marwa or Stephen?
I would I don't know, I would nuance a bit, Josh, this narrative. I think there has been secularization in the region and in the Arab world. I mean, if you look at the rise of nationalism and Arabism, it was about forging an identity away from religion, and that's why it united Christians and Muslims around this idea of an Arab identity. And so, and it happened. It happened also in Turkey with Ataturk. You know, it was really a secular, you know, trend and movement, which, you know, sort of was the driver for state making in Turkey as well, in modern Turkey. So I don't think this is totally absent of the Middle East or the Arab world. And I would say now we have a move towards a return to religion and to sectarianism, but it's only a recent development. And if you have a more, you know, deep historical perspective, you can say that it's possible to reverse the movement. And I don't think people only relate to each other as, you know, by their religion. I mean, if you go to the region or you grow up in the region, sometimes you grow up not knowing the religion of your friends. So I don't think it's like as stigmatized as it's being portrayed now. And the irony today is that Saudi Arabia and Iran are on the same side when it comes to IS. How is that possible if we have only, you know, an essentialist approach to it, thinking, well, the Shia and Sunnis, they should be hating each other. They cannot get along or decide, you know, that they have a common enemy. So I think there is hope in that sense for the future. And I believe it's also the role of intellectuals and writers and thinkers and all of us here today to promote another narrative and to develop a vision in that sense for the societies and to desectarianize. I'll go back to that term.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll take the microphone and I'll.
Thank you. Joanne Cummings, State Department instructor at the Air Force Academy. And I was in Syria when the change occurred, of course, until we closed. But my question has to do more with the discussion that we were having about the current transformation of communal identity. Because at least in my experience in the civil war in Lebanon and in Syria and in other places, including Iraq, the sense of communal identity and the degree to which it shifted from we are us to we are us against you was directly related to the degree to which you had been shot at for an identity. And the factor that I don't think we've brought out, although Marwa, you did mention it, is that in many cases people have a mixture of identities. You may be a Sunni Arab in Kirkuk and your mother is a Shia Turkmen. What you get shot at for being becomes your predominant identity in terms of conflict. So yes, I agree, and I really do believe that the idea that we can be citizens without reference to religion, I mean, that is still there. But the sense of a multiplicity of identities, I think, makes it easier to get there. And we've moved from a mixture of identities to a core identity. And does that make it more difficult to move forward?
Okay, that's
long question.
Is that the question? Okay, thank you. Does anyone on the panel want to take on that question?
Well, in some ways, I think all of us tried to comment on precisely that issue, because I think the whole question concerning the potential for the reversibility of a context in which sectarian identities have become both dominant and profoundly polarized hinges on whether opportunities exist to shift the balance of identity expression in ways that create opportunities for that broader range, that much kind of richer menu of possibilities for how people define themselves to again become meaningful. And one of the really important questions is that a cause of a process through which conflict will diminish and opportunities for reconciliation expand, or is it an effect of a longer-term period in which Syrians become so thoroughly exhausted by conflict that they're once again ready to think about how they engage one another in more pluralistic terms, in which narrowly defined, more assertive, more militaristic conceptions of what your identity requires of you fade? And I don't know that we have a very good answer to that question. I don't know that the social sciences have a very good answer to the question of whether, in effect, reconciliation is a cause of conflict resolution or an effect of conflict resolution. But I would argue that at the moment, I think that the opportunities for tempering some of these extreme, more assertive, militaristic conceptions of identity are fairly weak. And that until we can somehow create an environment in which people are no longer compelled, not just by their own internal sense of survival strategies, but by the environment that forces them into much narrower, more assertive, aggressive conceptions of who they are. Until we can reach that point, I think it's going to be very hard to get there. It's the question Joshua was posing. We can imagine solutions, but how we bridge the gap that would permit us to reach them is still a very difficult question to answer.
Over dinner, Stephen Heydemann reminded me that he's on an Eastern time zone in terms of his schedule, which is almost 11 o'clock. So let's just take maybe two more questions, one here and one there, and then we'll wrap it up. Can I get the microphone?
I would ask the panel to comment on the proposition that the fracturing of peoples in the Middle East is strongly dependent upon the gnawing feeling in their stomachs because they're hungry, and that the use of the Middle East for economic gain to the West needs to be reversed, and that when that happens and people don't have that gnawing feeling in their stomach, then they will turn to ways to live better together that have nothing to do with sectarianism.
That strikes me more of as a comment rather than a question. Does anyone want to comment on the comment?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think that economic collapse in most of these Middle Eastern governments, population explosion, youth bulge, the growing inflation, commodity price rises. There's been a whole bunch of studies done on how a growing class of poverty, even though some were getting rich at the top, the income gap it was tremendous and tons of pressure on people. And I think that under those circumstances, you do get the breakdown. And once you get the breakdown, it's a vicious cycle towards sectarianism. And that's one contributing factor, and I think it's been a dominant one throughout the Middle East.
Just a slightly different perspective, perhaps. I agree very much that a deepening sense of economic exclusion, the whole notion of dignity denied, of an absence of economic and social justice was clearly important in animating the uprisings. But all of the research we have makes very, very clear that there's no correlation between poverty and extremism. If you read the book by Alan Kruger, an economist at Princeton, who tested these assumptions about the relationship between poverty and affinity for terrorist groups and extremist ideologies, he didn't find it. It's largely the middle class and upper middle class that finds its life opportunities constrained, their their expectations eroded, the barriers to social mobility very high. That tends to become the principal pool from which extremists are drawn, not the very poor.
My Two questions, two real quick questions. First is, now that we're seeing ISIS become a major player in the region, our response is driven by their actions. What role do you see them playing as a legitimate kind of force in the region? Are they invited to the table for the ceasefire that all three of you kind of mentioned? Are they kind of negotiated in a federalist, system that's kind of arranged if the borders are redrawn? What role do you see them playing? And then the second is, there was a great piece in Politico about a week or so back talking about the collapse of Arab civilization in general.
The author was Hashem Milham.
Yep. And I was wondering what your thoughts in response to that article was, and what kind of hope there is for an Arab revitalization in the region.
Thanks. You can.
Just on the article by Hashem, who's the bureau chief for El Arabiya Television in Washington, he's very concerned. He's a bit of a provocateur, and so he made this very, very sharply worded argument that ISIS is an inevitable product of the collapse of civilization, of these cosmopolitan civilizations in the Arab world. I think he's being intentionally somewhat extreme in the argument he makes, but his intent is to ensure that conversations about the causes of extremism in the Arab world, and in particular of ISIS, don't neglect the responsibility of Arab leaders in particular themselves. And I think he feels very strongly that in the Arab world there is an inclination to look outside for the causes of some of these very destructive negative phenomena. And he wants to broaden the debate, especially among Arabs themselves, about how their own history of 60 years of corrupt, brutal authoritarian governance has contributed to the rise of some of these movements. I won't comment on the earlier part of your question. Maybe others would.
I just want to say this article that you read, this debate has been taking place in the Arab world since years and years. I mean, we have it reflected now because of the Arab Spring, because of what is happening in Syria, but there's been an ongoing debate about how to revive, the Arab world, this idea of the socio-economic development versus corruption versus, and I started my talk by saying that the Syrian revolution didn't start out of, religious motives. It was clearly about social and economic dimensions. And this idea, now we don't talk about it, but this idea of social justice and dignity really resonated around the Arab world. And I would link it to that discussion about, the collapse or the revival of the Arab world. And the debates are very interesting on Facebook, on blogs, etc. So it's good that at least some articles are written in English so that it's also, reflected outside of the Arab world. Now, about the Islamic State, it's an emerging actor. I would say there are studies also which show not only the link, that there's no link correlation between poverty and extremism, I would say even between the practice of Islam and radicalization, which is interesting. And often, these militants or combatants who join the Islamic State are not initially very practicing Muslims, or they don't even know very much about their religion. And the ones who are really practicing and faithful can join maybe some Islamist groups, but this extremism and extreme radicalism is mainly drawing on the, somehow the, maybe the young men that I interviewed who were from Medan. They were just repeating sentences as if they were brainwashed. And when I was asking them questions, when I told them, for example, the Shias are not Muslims, they suddenly got almost angry at me and started wanting to know what my agenda was and who I was. I was speaking to them in Arabic, of course. And then they just kept on repeating, their lesson, like, taking excerpts of the Quran that I'm sure they had just learned recently and they didn't know. So what is interesting here is that it's a recent phenomenon. It's sort of feeding on dissatisfaction. It's feeding on chaos as well. And what we're seeing in Iraq and Syria is about chaos beyond, religious affiliations. And I would say now, some are saying that IS is overrated, that this, proclamation of the state, although they are resisting now to the US airstrikes. What is also interesting is that they are very smart in their implementation. They're providing welfare services in the areas where they're settling down. So they're sort of like relieving the populations at the same time, imposing a very brutal and harsh rule. But sometimes you read, on the blogs, the Arab blogs, people saying at least they know what to expect with them, whereas sometimes with some of the rebels or some of the other groups, they don't know what the red lines are, and there's a lot of arbitrary rules, etc. So they're playing their game smartly. Does it mean that they're very well implemented? I don't think so, because this is a very alien tradition for Syria to have such radical extremist, applications of Islam being implemented and being imposed also on non-Islamic populations. As I'll come back, and perhaps this is, my mantra tonight, but I want to say that there has been coexistence between the different communities.
Josh, the question about the Hisham Melham article about the collapse of Arab civilization and ISIS.
Obviously, you'd have to be stupid today as an Arab not to question what went wrong. Clearly there is a major crisis spread from one end of the Arab world to the other, and Hisham Melham is doing that, as many other people are trying to figure out. On the question, though, I think which ties into this, on the ISIS question, I don't think ISIS is going to be sitting down at the table, but Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda branch, and we bombed them pretty severely just the other day, and it caused an uproar in Syria from all the rebel groups who feel that al-Qaeda in Syria is really an integral part of their uprising against this regime. And for the weeks before we bombed them, al-Qaeda had been asking to be taken off the terrorist list. It had been searching around desperately, using the Turks and others to try to run interference, because they did not want to be bombed. The trouble is, of course, this Khorasan group, Zawahiri and his people, had sent all these people to Syria, and there's a tremendous tension between al-Qaeda on the ground in Syria that sees itself as Syrian, and its major struggle is to get rid of Assad. And Zawahiri and central al-Qaeda, which sees the far enemy as still its big enemy, meaning America. And that contradiction runs right through many of the Islamist groups. We saw the leadership of Ahrar al-Sham and this Islamic Front blown up a week ago. But there's been some wonderful articles showing how the heads of those invited al-Qaeda into their groups in the beginning because it was easy money, and they got tons of money and arms, and it was key to their growth. But then they became captive to these foreign fighters and others, and they didn't want to be. And so I think that elemental questioning at the heart of the revolution of what do we want to be as Syrians? Do we want to be part of this Islamic fight against the West? Or do we want to just be part of fixing Syria? And that, I think, runs right through, and it's part of the Hisham Melham question of, what are we trying to, who do we want to be, and what are we trying to fix? Is our fight with America and the West and materialism, or is our fight here in Syria to somehow make a better Syria? And I think, I don't know where we haven't really come to any answers, but those questions are at the heart of the politics going on today amongst the rebel groups as they face ISIS and American bombing.
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of tonight's program. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel for being with us tonight.